In this lecture, you are going to learn about the origins of the abolitionist movement and the abolitionist movement in Canada and the United States. When discussing the abolitionist movement, we need to take note that the early abolitionists of slavery were in fact captives and slaves themselves, who adopted various methods of resistance from their captor in Africa up to their sale and enslavement on plantations in the Americas and the Caribbean. Adapting to survival, running away, rebellion, and suicide were some of the attitudes they adopted. The American colonies were frequently disrupted by revolts and threats of revolt by their slaves. The administrators of the British French colonies in the Caribbean testified in the 1730s that a wind of freedom was blowing on the Caribbean, thereby indicating the existence of bearable contagion of phenomena of resistance to slavery, as was to occur some 50 years later on the occasion of the rebellion of the slaves in San Domingo. The late 18th century brought some changes in ideology. European revolutionaries argued that slave labor was inherently less productive than free labor and it ought to be abolished. At the same time, another group, also favoring abolition of the slave trade, insisted that trafficking slaves was immoral. In London, they created communities, often led by Quakers, to lobby Parliament for an end of the slave trade. Pamphlets, reports, and personal narratives denounced the traffic in people. In response to the abolitionist efforts, the North Atlantic powers moved to prohibit the slave trade. Denmark acted first in 1803, and Great Britain followed in 1807. To enforce the ban, Britain posted a naval squadron off the coast of West Africa to prevent any slave trade above the equator. But diminishing the slave trade to the Americas was but the beginning of ending slavery in the continent. The road towards the abolition of slavery in the Americas will be a long one, and in the case of the United States, it will require a bloody war to end an institution that preceded the creation of the Republic. Not a lot of people know that slavery existed in what is now Canada. It is estimated that more than 4,000 Indigenous and Black people were enslaved in Canada from the colonization of New France in the early 1600s until 1834. When the Slavery Abolitionist Act came into effect throughout the British Empire, including British North America, the movement towards the abolition of slavery in Canada began in the late 1700s. British abolitionists had actively opposed the transatlantic trade in African people since the 1770s. Such anti-slavery views spread to Upper Canada, influencing the passage there of the 1793 Act to limit slavery, the first such legislation in the British colonies. In 1803, Chief Justice William Ossoge placed on the law books the ruling that slavery was inconsistent with British law. Although this did not legally abolish slavery, 300 slaves were set free in Lower Canada, the future Quebec. Citizens who wanted to bargain in the slave trade had no protection from the courts. The decline of slavery took place in Upper Canada as well. The short growing season and cost of feeding and clothing slaves, along with abolitionist sentiments, caused more and more slaves to be set free. Moreover, individual legal challenges, first raised in the late 1700s, also began to undermine the institution of enslavement in Canada. Judges who favor abolition were handing down more and more decisions against slave owners. As a result, when the British Imperial Act of 1833 abolished slavery throughout the British Empire, very few slaves remained in Upper and Lower Canada. For most enslaved people in British North America, however, the act resulted in only partial liberation, as it only emancipated children under the age of 6, while others were to be retained by their former owners for 4 to 6 years as apprentices. The British government made available some money to pay for damages suffered by owners of registered slaves, but none of the money was sent to slaveholders in British North America. Those who had been enslaved did not receive any compensation either. The abolition of slavery in Canada had a ripple effect, and in the decades after 1833 saw an increase in abolitionist sympathizers as the fugitive slaves from the United States increased in numbers and found freedom in Canada. In 1850, the United States passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which legalized the capture of those who had escaped enslavement in the North and the return to slaveholders in the South. The law also prohibited citizens from helping fugitives reach freedom. Its enactment spurred the migration of 15,000 to 20,000 African American refugees to Canada in the decade that followed. Some found their own way across the border, while others came via the Underground Railroad. The Anti-Slavery Society of Canada was formed in Canada West, now Ontario, in 1851 to promote the global abolition of slavery and provide relief to African American refugees seeking freedom in Canada. Led by influential residents of the province from black and white communities alike, the society was active until the early 1860s. The refugees' plight generated public discussion in Canada. In 1850, it was the subject of a sympathetic meeting at the Mechanics' Institute in Toronto and the subject of pro-abolition editorials in various newspapers. However, some reactions were far from sympathetic. Historian Robin Wink cites growing evidence of organized group prejudice in Canada West. including petitions and campaigns against black settlements near Chatham, an important center of the Underground Railroad. Nevertheless, despite this resistance, the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada continued its efforts to end slavery in the United States. Although the impact of the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada is subject of debate, what is important to remember is that the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada helped spread abolitionist sentiments in Canada while providing aid and advocacy for refugees of the U.S. slave trade. It is not surprising that around the 1830s in the United States, Northern challenges to slavery surfaced with increasing frequency and resolve. Politicians, religious leaders, women's associations, and free blacks who had fled the South had set up groups of sympathizers and newspapers. Beginning in free black communities with condemnations of racism from individuals like David Walker and Maria Stewart. Among these black abolitionists were also runaway slaves like Frederick Douglass that gave a voice to those who were still in bondage. Also, white Northern abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison took anti-slavery agitation to new heights by advocating immediate abolition in his newspaper, The Liberator, founded in 1831 in Boston. Soon, the abolitionist movement in the United States became more organized, and in 1832, Garrison supporters started the New England Anti-Slavery Society. By 1833, anti-slavery groups were organized in Philadelphia and New York. Women also play a prominent role in abolition, just as they did in moral reform and evangelical religion. However, despite this growth in support, many white Northerners were not prepared to embrace immediate or gradual emancipation. Although they might have opposed the institution of slavery, most remained anti-black and therefore anti-abolition. Meanwhile, in the South, people will be willing to do everything to protect and be able to expand the institution of slavery. Ultimately, it will take a war and the passing of the 13th Amendment for the United States to abolish slavery. That is all for now. Please stay tuned for the next video lecture to learn more.